When I first bought my land out by the lake, I did it for peace, privacy, and the kind of freedom you only get when you own every square inch of your property with no one breathing down your neck telling you what kind of mailbox you're allowed to have, what color your house should be, or whether your grass is an approved shade of green. But little did I know that moving into what was supposed to be my sanctuary would put me face to face with one of the most homeowners associations I'd ever seen in my life. And this wasn't your regular pushy HOA that sent letters about trash cans left out too long. No, these people had a board led by one of the most conniving women I'd ever met, Karen, who believed that everyone within her community should bend to her control even if the law didn't say so. And I found that out on the very first day I moved in when a few of them came knocking on my cabin. Demand that I sign their HOA agreement, claiming my land fell within their jurisdiction, even though I had already checked county records and confirmed multiple times that my parcel was outside their boundary lines, that I had my own title and surveyor's maps proving it, and that I was in no way obligated to join their little club. So when I calmly declined, Karen's fake smile cracked, and she narrowed her eyes at me like I'd just spat in half. Like her use that everyone around here is a member and that you'll find life difficult if you don't cooperate. But I wasn't about to be bullied, so I told her in no uncertain terms that my land was mine, that her rules didn't apply, and that she had best leave me alone, slamming the door behind her as her little entourage gasped. But the truth is, I didn't realize just how far Karen and her HOA were willing to go to try to rat working on some fencing along my boundary when a black and white vehicle rolled up with flashing lights, and two men stepped out in what looked like police uniforms, except something about them felt off. The patches weren't quite right. The badges looked generic, and they were wearing sneakers instead of regulation boots, and they strutted up to me trying to intimidate, saying they had a complaint from the HOA that I was violating community codes by I can wire from the HOA that I was violating community codes by could issue fines and even remove it. But instead of panicking, I calmly leaned on my shovel, asked to see their identification, and when they flashed their badges too quickly, I caught enough of a glimpse to notice they didn't match our county sheriff insignia at all, so I pushed harder, asked what precinct they were from, and when they fumbled with their words, it hit me like a brick. These weren't cops at all. They were hired imposters, probably sick of it. Karen playing dress up, trying to scare me into compliance. So I pulled out my phone, dialed the actual sheriff's office, and started describing the situation right in front of them, which made the so-called officers pale as they realized the jig was up. And before they could even retreat, I managed to snap a few clear photos of their faces, their car, and their fake uniforms, telling them the sheriff would want to speak to them immediately. And that's what driveway like scared kids caught shoplifting, leaving me standing there with all the evidence I needed. Furious, but also curious, because if Karen and her HOA were willing to send fake cops just to intimidate me into joining, what else were they hiding? And why were they so desperate to control me specifically? So I spent that night digging deeper into property records, and that's when I discovered the real kicker. Not only was my land completal, only was my land completal. Where Karen and her board held their meetings, collected dues, and lorded over their neighbors wasn't actually theirs at all. The parcel it sat on was legally part of my acreage, a strip of land that had been misfiled years ago and overlooked by everyone except me when I carefully traced the survey markers, meaning the Oak had built their precious headquarters smack dab on property I owned, and suddenly everything clicked. Our desperation to party, think desperation to Odedemrivel. Fake cops. It was all about keeping me from realizing the leverage I held, and once I understood that, I knew the game had changed entirely, because they thought they could scare me into silence, but instead, they had handed me the ultimate weapon, and from that day forward, it was no longer about just protecting my peace, it was about teaching Karen and her HOA once and for all that when you mess with a man on his own land, especially a man on his own land, especially a man nigh, man's a man on his own land, especially a man not better, better be ready for the consequences. The morning after I uncovered the truth that the HOA office itself was sitting illegally on my land, I woke up with a grin that wouldn't leave my face because suddenly the power dynamic had flipped and Karen's smug threats didn't seem so intimidating anymore. In fact, they seemed downright pathetic now that I held the kind of leverage that could unravel their entire operation in one move. But instead of rushing in guns blazing, I decided to learn from dealing with bullies. It's that they thrive on control. And the best way to break them isn't just to say no, it's to slowly strip away the illusion of power they've built. And I knew Karen had spent years weaving her little web of influence over the neighborhood, convincing residents to follow rules that weren't even legally binding in some cases, threatening fines and citations that only held weight if people believed they did, and sitting in inly held weight if people believed they did, and sitting in front the appointed queen. So to dismantle that, I needed not only proof of their misconduct, but also a strategy that would expose them to the entire community. And I began by returning to the sheriff's office with the photos I'd taken of the fake cops, which caused an immediate stir because impersonating an officer is no small crime. And within days, the deputies had identified the men, traced them back to a private security firm that had no board had been the ones who hired them, signing checks directly from HOA funds, which meant every dues-paying member had unknowingly financed a criminal stunt. And that little piece of evidence became my first hammer blow, because I printed the sheriff's report and anonymously slipped it into the mailboxes of every HOA member, making sure people saw with their own eyes that the board they were paying to protect the neighborhood was actually dragging the 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 promomo for hagging the protectapin hidden like shul. Being protect the neighborhood was actually dragging the protect the neighborhood was expected. It caused an uproar. Neighbors who once smiled politely at Karen were suddenly whispering behind her back. Parents were furious that fake cops had been roaming around their street, and one elderly couple even marched into the HOA office demanding answers, which Karen tried to spin as a misunderstanding. But the damage was already done. Cracks had begun to form in her facade of authority, and I was just getting started. Meeting with my attorney to review the land records I had uncovered, and sure enough, he confirmed every detail. The HOA office building, the parking lot, even the little manicured strip of lawn out front, all sat squarely on my parcel, and not only that, but they had never filed for any kind of easement or lease agreement, meaning their very existence there was trespassing on my property, and legally, I had every right to reclaim it. And when I heard that, the grin spread even wider, because now this wasn't just about teaching Karen a lesson. It was about turning the tables so dramatically that she would never forget who actually held the power. So I quietly filed the paperwork to assert my claim, registered a notice with the county clerk, and prepared the eviction documents that would legally force the HOA to vacate the premises. But before serving them, I decided double down before she backed down, and I wanted her arrogance to carry her right into the trap. So when she inevitably marched back to my door one evening, this time without her little fake cops but still puffed up with bluster, waving a paper that claimed I owed non-compliance fines for my fence, my trash bins, and even for having an unapproved doghouse, I simply smiled, took the paper from her, and asked if she had a moment to sit. Title deed across my dining table, watching her eyes dart nervously as I explained slowly and clearly that while she thought she had authority over me, the reality was that her office, her board's meeting space, and everything she thought was her stronghold sat on land that wasn't hers. And when I leaned in and whispered that I could evict her entire HOA with one signature, the blood drained from her face, though she tried to mask it with laughter, calling God, then storming out with her usual dramatic huff. But I could tell by the stiffness in her walk that I'd rattled her to her core, and sure enough, within a week, rumors started circulating that the board was reviewing their office arrangements, meaning she was already panicking behind the scenes, but panic wasn't enough. I wanted everyone to see the downfall, so I waited for the perfect moment, which came during the HOA's quarterly communa, very office to update them on budgets, projects, and enforcement. And that's when I made my move, walking right in with my lawyer by my side and a stack of documents, interrupting Karen mid-speech to announce, loud enough for everyone to hear, that as the rightful owner of the land beneath their feet, I was hereby serving an eviction notice, effective immediately, because the HOA had been illegally occupying my property for years without permission. Some cheered, others shouted in confusion. But the one reaction I cherished most was Karen's. As her jaw dropped, her hands trembled, and for the first time since I'd met her, she was completely speechless, unable to spin her way out. And as I stood there, watching her crumble in front of the very people she'd lorded over for so long, I knew this was only the beginning of her unraveling. Because once you expose a tyrant's foundation as net, comes crashing down, and I was going to make sure that when it did, she would be buried under the weight of her own arrogance. After serving the eviction notice in front of the entire community, I expected Karen to come at me swinging with everything she had left. And sure enough, she didn't waste a single day before trying to claw back some semblance of power. Because when you take away a tyrant's throne, they'll scramble for any stick they can lean on to feel important again. So the very next morning, I woke up to find a letter duct taped to my gate, written in bow, to find a letter duct taped to my gate, written in bow. HOA, and threatening that they would take legal action for defamation, trespassing, and even slander, which made me laugh so hard I nearly choked on my coffee. Because the irony of her accusing me of trespassing when her entire office was literally squatting on my land was beyond rich. But instead of replying with anger, I did something far more effective. I ignored her completely, because silence drives people like Karen insane. And sure it to people like Karen insane. And sure as silence drives people like Karen insane. And sure it. Driveway again, yelling at my closed windows, waving papers like a street performer trying to draw a crowd. But nobody came to her defense, not even her fellow board members, who were already starting to distance themselves after realizing the legal mess she'd dragged them into. And that's when it really began to unravel for her. Because when people who once cheered for you suddenly look away, that's when you realize your empire is hollow. And people who once cheered for you suddenly look away, that's when you realize your empire is hollow. And Totline is upright, empire is hollow. And Top finds you had officially opened an investigation into the fake cops incident, summoning both the board president and Karen for questioning, which she tried to spin as a routine meeting to her neighbors, but word spread fast, and people began whispering about indictments, fines, and even jail time. And I just kept quietly feeding the fire by sharing documents, photos, and reports through anonymous channels, making sure the truth circulated without doubt, truth circulated without doubt. Finger directly at me, and as her grip loosened, I tightened mine, because while she was busy fighting rumors and investigations, I was finalizing the paperwork to legally seize the HOA office building. And once the county clerk processed my claim, I put up a massive sign on the property line that read, "Private property, trespassers will be prosecuted." And I'll never forget the sight of Karen arriving for her board meeting that evening. Couldn't remove, her face turning crimson as neighbors chuckled quietly, some even pulling out their phones to snap photos. And that humiliation must have stung worse than anything else, because from that moment, she doubled down on her vendetta against me, filing frivolous complaints, reporting me for code violations, even sending letters claiming my very cabin was non-compliant with HOA standards, despite the fact that I never compliant with HOA standards. Despite the fact that I never her vendetta was standards. Despite the fact that I never her vendetta was compliant. Of those attempts was met with the same cold reality. The county threw out her complaints, the sheriff dismissed her reports, and my attorney simply stacked her letters into a growing pile of evidence that painted her as obsessive and unhinged. And as her tantrums escalated, something else began to happen. Neighbors who once feared her started approaching me quietly. First one or two, then whole families, thanking me for standing up to her. Years, fined for trivial things like mailbox paint, garden gnomes, or Christmas lights, and they were desperate for a way out, which gave me an idea that would deliver the final blow. Because what if I not only took her office but dismantled the hoe from the inside, stripping away her dues, her board, and her authority until nothing remained, and the path to do it lay right there in my title deed, because once the HOA lost their office and were forced to petition the county for a permit, and when they did, I'd be waiting to challenge it with full proof of their fraud, their illegal hiring of fake cops, and their misuse of funds, effectively halting their ability to function. So when Karen stood on my porch one last time, screaming about how she would destroy me, I just smiled and told her plainly, "You've already destroyed yourself," then closed the door, leaving her sputtering on the other side. Had the evidence, the law, and the community all leaning in my direction now. And when the county hearing date arrived, I showed up with a binder so thick it could have doubled as a brick, laying out every misstep the HOA had made, from the fake cops to the illegal office. And when the commissioner looked over the documents, then turned to Karen and asked if she had any explanation, she tried to launch into one of her usual tirades. But this time, silence. The residents she claimed to represent shook their heads, and the commissioner slammed the gavel down, ruling that the HOA had no legal standing to operate until they resolved their violations, which was essentially a death sentence for her little fiefdom. And as we all walked out of that courthouse, Karen trailing behind like a deflated balloon, I couldn't help but smile, because the war she had started with me had ended in a way she never had started with me had ended in a way she never. Her rules, but with her empire of fake authority collapsing into dust at my feet. The days following the commissioner's ruling were some of the most surreal I had ever experienced, because for the first time in years, the neighborhood actually felt free, almost like a town shedding the weight of an occupying force, with residents suddenly mowing their lawns without fear of Karen's compliance patrols, kids riding bikes past dusk without being barked at, and holiday decorations popping up in yards, even though it wasn't technically the sea, though it wasn't technically the sea. The absence of tyranny itself, and while the community began to breathe again, Karen was unraveling in full view of everyone, because instead of retreating gracefully, she chose to double down in the most destructive ways possible, which only accelerated her downfall, since she started making flyers claiming the county had been bribed, yelling at people in the grocery store about conspiracies, and even camping outside the shuttered HOA office, Screetsby. Still in charge, though the office was now clearly marked with my property signs and under surveillance, meaning every rant she had was caught on camera, adding to the growing mountain of evidence I had against her. And it wasn't long before residents began openly mocking her, some even leaving dog toys, rubber chickens, and empty envelopes in her yard labeled fines, while others started pulling their payment histories from years of dues. Administrative fees that no one could account for, which was the perfect spark I needed to finally expose her fully. So I quietly reached out to a local investigative journalist, someone known for tearing into corrupt small-town politics, and handed him everything: the photos, the fake cop incident, the property records, the financial discrepancies, and the tapes of her public meltdowns. And within a week, his expose aired on the eve. My Land, interviews with residents who described Karen's bullying, and clips of her screaming about my rules outside shuttered board meetings. And the impact was immediate. People who had once tolerated her because of fear now viewed her as a spectacle, a neighborhood embarrassment, and even the board members who had once backed her began issuing public apologies, trying to salvage their reputations, but it was too late for them, because 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 too late for them. Not long after, Karen was served with official papers summoning her to court on charges of fraud, impersonation, misuse of funds, and yes, even criminal impersonation tied to the fake cop stunt, since she had knowingly approved it. And the day she was hauled out of her home in handcuffs was the day the neighborhood truly erupted, not in shock, but in cheers, with people gathering on sidewalks to watch the queen of fines and citations be stuffed. Screamed about property rights and illegal harassment. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife, because the only property rights that had mattered in the end were mine, the ones she had ignored when she set her office on land she didn't own, the same oversight that had allowed me to strip her empire down piece by piece. And in the aftermath, something fascinating happened. The HOA as an institution began to dissolve entirely. Not judge as an institution began to dissolve entirely. Not began to dissolve entirely. Not Judd wanted to step into her shoes. No one wanted to inherit a legacy of lawsuits, scandals, and angry neighbors. So meetings stopped, dues dried up, and slowly but surely the whole organization withered away until the HOA existed only in faded signs and abandoned paperwork, leaving the community to govern itself like it always should have. And instead of chaos, what followed was cooperation. Neighbors setting up voluntary cleanup deals. Lake, once a battleground for fines and rules, became a shared space again, where people swam, fished, and picnicked without fear of being cited. And standing there one evening, watching kids laughing on the shore while adults chatted freely, I realized the full scope of what had happened. Not only had I defeated Karen, but I had dismantled the entire apparatus of control she had built, proving that real community thrives when power is shared. Real community thrives when power is shared. Heard she was still tangled in court battles, trying desperately to convince judges that she had been the victim, not the perpetrator, but with every hearing, every piece of evidence, and every testimony stacked against her, the outcome was as inevitable as her downfall had always been, and I couldn't help but marvel at the poetic justice of it all. She had tried to rule a neighborhood she didn't own, weaponized fake cops to intimidate me, that the very foundation of her rule, the land her office stood on, was never hers to begin with. And in the end, the very thing she ignored, my quiet little deed, was what brought her entire empire crashing down. The weeks after Karen's arrest felt almost like stepping into a new world, one where the shadow of her petty dictatorship no longer loomed over every decision. No more envelopes demanding arbitrary compliance fines. No more threats scribbled on neon paper shoved into mailboxes. No more self-appointed patrols taking photos of garden gnomes or measuring grass height. And as the air cleared, it became evident just how much psychological weight had avoided each other out of fear of being reported, started inviting one another over for cookouts. Block parties sprouted on weekends, and laughter that had once been stifled behind closed doors echoed freely in yards again, almost as though the neighborhood had collectively awakened from a long and bizarre nightmare. And while I could have quietly faded back into life at my cabin, content that the monster had been vanquished, I knew there was a Zornvak. Karen's empire hadn't just been about bullying. It had been about control, money, and power. And while the county had hit her with criminal charges, the financial devastation she had left behind was still unresolved, with years of stolen dues, fraudulent fines, and misused community funds that had disappeared into the abyss of her administration. And I wasn't about to let her escape accountability by hiding behind banker. Behind banker of residents to build a class action lawsuit, pooling together every shred of documentation, every fine notice, every receipt, and every unexplained assessment she had issued over the years. And when our attorneys tallied it all up, the number was staggering. Nearly $2 million siphoned from homeowners through fraudulent claims and intimidation, money that had gone to vacations, personal shopping sprees, and shady side projects disguised as paper hardened everyone's resolve, because it wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice, about clawing back what was stolen. And when the case went to court, Karen's attempts to paint herself as a community servant unfairly persecuted crumbled under the sheer mountain of evidence, with residents testifying about harassment, false violations, and threats, while my own testimony about the fake cop stunt and the office ed smug queen of fines who had built her empire on lies and not see her for exactly what she was. And in the end, the verdict was decisive. Guilty on multiple counts of fraud, restitution ordered, assets seized, and a long probationary period tied to mandatory community service, not as a leader, but as a worker, someone who would spend her mornings picking up trash on the side of highways under the watchful eye of real authorities. A pup. By real authorities. A pup? And Minna would spend her mornings picking up trash on the side of highways under the watchful eye of real authorities. A pup, who once obsessed over pointing out imaginary violations, now had to clean up actual litter for years to come. And though she never stopped screaming about conspiracies and vendettas, her voice grew smaller with every passing month, drowned out by the laughter of the community she had once terrorized, a community now thriving without her. And while the financial settlement didn't return every dollar stolen, it restored enough faith that people began now planting gardens and fixing what had been neglected under her reign, and the neighborhood transformed into something it had never been before, a place of genuine freedom, where neighbors governed themselves with common sense rather than fear. And I, for my part, went back to living quietly by the lake. Though now, whenever I walked into town, people nodded, shook my hand, or even stopped to thank me for standing up when no one else dared, and even stopped to thank me for standing up when no one else dared. And because I knew the truth, that all I had really done was use the leverage Karen never considered, the deed to the land beneath her empire, the single overlooked fact that made all her threats meaningless, and it struck me how often tyranny collapses not because of grand battles, but because of small details, the kind arrogant people are too blinded by their own power to notice. And as the sun set one evening over the lake, the waters reflecting go with you. Go waters reflecting go. Go waters reflecting go. Goers reflecting go. Story was more than just neighborhood drama. It was a cautionary tale, a reminder that power taken through intimidation always unravels, and that the loudest, most domineering voices are often the weakest when confronted with truth. And so I raised a quiet toast on my porch to the downfall of an empire built on lies, satisfied that justice had been served, order restored, and that the HOA, which once ruled through fear, was now nothing more than a ka, which once ruled through fear, was now nothing more than a ka. Chuckles at block parties, forever overshadowed by the irony that it had all crumbled, not because of protests or bribes, but because their grand office, symbol of their power, was never theirs at all, standing all along on land